Morning everyone. As Nigel said, I'm just going to be talking about looking at different varieties and how they differ in their competitiveness. So as we all know, all varieties look a lot different, and they all have different ways of how they compete with weeds in the paddock and different levels of competitiveness. Before I start, I'd just like to thank all the contributing sponsors. I've got some heart trials in here, so I just thank everyone at Heart. There's a durum project that I've mentioned that's through the South Australian Durum Growers Association, which is sponsored by Sagat, and a couple GRDC funded projects. And I'd just like to thank you all for leaving the Strathmore at a reasonable hour to be here today. So why are we doing all this work? So obviously you would have seen Chris Preston's presentation this morning, and we are getting more and more resistance, and we're relying more and more heavily on the pre-emergent chemicals. So obviously we've got the ones that are inevitably going to escape, so the ones that come up later or have the resistance gene. So by having a competitive variety, it's a way of stopping these weeds that escape that pre-emergent chemical and reducing their seed set. So not only giving you a reduced seed set, but also varieties will differ in their yield loss. Obviously they've got more weeds in them, they haven't competed well, then those weeds are going to be stealing moisture and nutrients and those sort of things. We have our specific chemicals which control our specific weeds. So we've got our box of Golden Secure that are looking after our ryegrass, but we've got other things like radish and marshmallows and things like that. And having a competitive variety will not only control that one weed, but hopefully will go away to controlling all the different types of weeds that are in your paddock. As I mentioned, the project's included in this. I've already covered that fairly well, so I'll skip over that. So we're just going to start with the barley. So basically we've got in 2 trial sites at Turretfield and Karoonda over the last couple of years. Tested a range of different varieties. So we've got Karoonda and Turretfield, we've got a high rainfall and a low rainfall site. So we actually, to simulate these weed competition trials, we actually the way we do it is we plant oats into the trial first. So we'll actually sow over it twice. So we just put the tines just so they scratch the top of the surface, pull all the tubes out of the seeder, so we get a nice even spread over the seed bed, and then we'll come back through and sow it. So we're simulating putting weeds in the seed bed, either side of the row, and so it's on the top and the bottom. Then we'll harvest it all together, take a sub-sample and try our best to separate the oats from the barley. So just using grain cleaners and sieves and things like that. And then obviously we can separate the oats and we can estimate the yield of the oats and how many seeds per square metre are getting away from the crop. So the results, these are from the results at Turretfield. Obviously we've got, down the bottom here, we've got varieties such as Fathom and Maritime. These are obviously, you probably know them fairly well. They're really high biomass sort of varieties. They get out of the ground quickly, they branch over the row, and they stop the sunlight getting to those weeds, so they can't photosynthesize and things like that. So if you look on the y-axis here, this is actually the yield loss. So obviously they've got less of a yield loss because they've managed to stop those weeds, and so they're not stealing that nutrient and water. If you look at the other end, we've got varieties like Hindmarsh and the Trobe, who are pretty much identical. If you all know, you've seen them, and they grow really erect, and which is why they're such great varieties, because they probably have that bit extra drought tolerance, I guess you'd call it. And because of that, they don't crowd over the rows, and so those weeds are getting away. So because they're stealing that moisture and nutrient away from the crop, then they're obviously getting a yield penalty. Other varieties here, like your Navigators and your Oxfords and Gairdners, are the ones that they're a bit slower getting going. So they're more later maturing varieties that take a bit more to get going, so those weeds are getting on top of them before they have a chance to stop them. If we look at the amount of actual seeds per square metre that it's producing, so when we sow these, we put in about 75 plants per square metre of weeds, and so that is quite a large figure. If you're getting 1,400 seeds per square metre, you'd probably be pretty worried planting into it the next year. But so a similar story as before. So the ones that had less of a loss also reduced the amount of seed set. So once again, we got down the bottom, we got varieties like Fathom and Maritime, and at the top we've got Hindmarsh and the elated maturing ones. Interesting to note that Mace, in all the trials we've had, the reason we've had Mace in there, obviously it's just good to compare. We all know that barley is a better competitor than Mace, than wheats. But it actually, in all the trials that I've seen, Mace has had a less of a yield loss, but obviously that's produced more seeds. So there must be an interaction there that wheat must be a bit stronger to withstand that weed pressure, that it doesn't actually have that yield penalty like the barley would. I don't know why. I'm willing to take answers at the end of if anyone has any ideas. So just looking at the economics of that. So obviously, as I said, they're under high extreme weed pressure. This is just based on a price. I took it Monday last week from an undisclosed grain company, estimating that if obviously the varieties that haven't achieved mould accreditation do get it, and just their price on that day. So if you look, obviously it's going to change when season changes and prices and things like that. But just on that data, and then on if we were to sell it last week, we're looking at $150 a tonne loss for Fathom, for example. And then you go down the bottom and you're looking at Hindmarsh for $303 lost. So basically, you've got to decide if you're planting into a weedy paddock that you know has a bad weed history, whether you're better off putting in a high vigour variety that has better weed competition like Fathom, rather than going for your elite yielder. So obviously you're going to have them, your farmers are going to have them stocked on farm and they want to use them. So maybe just think about your planning and putting those higher yielding, less competitive varieties in your cleaner paddocks, and then your paddocks that have a higher weed burden, then maybe going for a Fathom. And obviously Fathom's really good for grazing and things like that, so you're going to have benefits there as well. So just to look at that in another way, so we're looking at, over here we've got oat seed production and the loss of income. So obviously we've got Fathom, Maritime, as I've talked about down below here. And then you could probably draw a straight line there, but when you look at the yield loss that they receive, it's probably pretty substantial, and even that's probably a 40% increase in weed seed production, which you've got to work out, once again, is how much of those, controlling those weeds, how much is that worth? So obviously you've got your $150 gain between Fathom and Hindmarsh, but then you're also losing money because you've got a higher weed burden in your paddock. So you just got to work it out, and then not every system's the same, and everyone's going to have a different opinion, but you just got to work out if you've got a high weed paddock, whether you're really worth off just growing the one variety and having that second variety up your sleeve in case for certain situations. So now we'll just move on to another trial that was run at Hart. So this is part of a trial funded by Sagat through the Durum Growers Association. Basically, it's looking at trying to increase the wheat competitiveness of durum wheat. So I'm guessing there's a few of your clients and farmers out here that are going to be looking into going into durum next year with the high price that we've received. And obviously there's reasons why people have dropped it in the past, like your screenings and things like that, and your reduced yield. But one reason that some people weren't happy with it was obviously the weed control. Historically, durum is a poor competitor, but so that's why we're looking at different ways to improve that weed control. So, as I said, in this trial at Hart, we've actually compared durum variety DBA Aurora, which is newly released, versus Mace, which isn't the greatest wheat competitor, but durum's competing against Mace's space in the paddock, I guess. So it was interesting to look at that. So how we did this trial is a little bit different. So this was with ryegrass. So we've just had split it into 3 sections. So 1, 2 and 3, and then we've spread ryegrass over the whole area and then sprayed out certain sections to create a no weed plot. So in this trial we're looking at difference between durum and mace, also looking at the impact of spreader boots and seeding rates. So how high a seeding rate can you go to control those weeds without hurting your end quality? So the results, couldn't really find a lot of difference between, a significant statistical difference between spreader boots. I think that was the numbers were a bit over the top with the actual plant numbers. So my theory was that when we planted it, because just the way that the machine was set up, and it isn't a commercial machine as such. When we put the spreader boots on it, the press wheels didn't actually hit the plants as well as what it would have if it was going straight down a normal boot. So emergence wasn't as good, which could have affected the results. But yeah, interesting. We couldn't see much of a difference there. And in trials in the past, there hasn't been a great deal of difference. But whether that's machine, and obviously there's a lot of different machine versions out there that probably would make a good difference. So these are just the raw data. I'll move on to the next slide, and we might be able to see it a little bit better. So we're just looking at the difference between mace and aurora here. So as the bubble gets bigger, that it represents the amount of ryegrass heads per square metre. And then obviously we've got the yield over this side, and down the bottom here we've got the percentage decrease. So that's the yield of the weed plot, the plot with weeds compared to the one that didn't have them. So how much was losing in that. So if we look here, no significant difference in statistics between the amount of ryegrass produced between DBA Aurora and mace wheat, which is pretty promising for people actually getting back into durum, saying that they're not going to get hit by those weeds as much as what they would have in the past with some less competitive varieties. Just on that, I know that if there's still some of your farmers looking out there to get seed for Aurora, I think it's all pretty much gone, but Saintly is another really good option in terms of competitiveness. So that's right up there with Aurora in terms of competitiveness. They're on par, so that's another option to think about. If we look at the yield decrease, as we got the seeding rates, there was the difference between 300 and 100 and 200 was significant. So as we went up to 300, it stopped those weeds, and then we didn't see as much of a yield decrease. So this is just a picture of mace, 100 plants per square metre compared to 300 plants per square metre. As you can see, a lot more light getting into the canopy here compared to a much thicker crop here. So 300s, I guess that's around 100. I think just off the top of my head, a bit over 110 kilograms per hectare, if you're still speaking that way. So it's a higher seeding rate, but it just made it a lot thicker. And obviously, if you're getting less light into the canopy, the less there is for the weeds to take it and grow. So just on the quality of that, the significant findings were that as we increased seeding rate, it actually decreased screenings. So by being able to stop those weeds, there was more moisture there at the end for those plants to hang on and reduce the screenings. Obviously, Aurora is going to have higher screenings than mace, so we expect that given that it's a durum versus a bred wheat. So significant findings, mace and durum both reduced ryegrass and screenings percentage as seeding rate increased. DBA Aurora and mace wheat, there was no significant difference between the two in terms of their competitiveness, which is, as I said, quite exciting. Mace had less of a yield loss than DBA Aurora when under high weed pressure. Obviously, we all know that durums are a bit weak, a bit like the Adelaide crows, and so they didn't hold on as well as what the bred wheat did. And varying seeding rates can change the amount of crop loss under high weed pressure. And there's no significant finding between the normal and spreader boots, as I said before, and all the other quality tests didn't show much difference. So durum is equal to bred wheat in terms of competition. So now we just look at the wheat trials that we've conducted. So these are over the last couple of years. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get this year's results in on time due to too much stuff going on at work and other things. So I apologise for that, but we've still got last year's results and I'll run through them. So this trial was conducted same way as the barley. Obviously it's a little bit easier to get the oats out of the wheat, so that made that job a little bit easier, but once again they're all harvested together, a sub-sample was taken, took it back to the lab, separated it, and then we're able to estimate the amount of seed production per square metre and the yield loss, and also how it was affected. So, as I said, these are from trials conducted at Palmer and Turretfield, so these are the average of them. So the results from them, the results from this trial last year, we had this is 2013, sorry. So the results were a bit over the shop. We had that dry finish, and there wasn't a lot of correlation between the Turretfield and the Palmer results. So I'm not confident in these. While I'm on this too, I'll just mention Michael Zerner, who previously worked at SARDI. He did a lot of this work in the wheat side of things. So I'll just acknowledge him for his work. So if we look at it though, there is still some patterns you'd expect to see. Obviously you've got your axe down the bottom here, which is that get out of the ground early and get on top of the weeds. So as we see on the y-axis, we've got the oat seed production. So they was able to get out of the axe was getting out of the ground early, getting on top of those weeds and stopping them and reducing their seed set. At the other end, wild caption's a good one to look at, much like mace. Obviously, when we're talking about high marsh hours erect, I guess wild caption's the same sort of thing. It hasn't got big leaves. It doesn't take much room in the seed side, in the rows, and isn't able to get on top of those weeds. If we look at the yield loss, so this isn't. So I should say that this is different calculations to the other one. This is actually percentage of the site mean, not seeds per square metre, actual percentage loss. So once again, it shows a similar story as before, with axe getting out of the ground earlier and stopping those weeds, so they didn't have as much of a yield effect. If we move on to, this is actually a trial conducted by AGT, and I thank the kind people at AGT for letting me use their data just to compare to ours. Shows that it's, there do some similarities. They do theirs a bit differently. You have to ask them how they do that. I think there's a gentleman in the crowd that might be able to help you there. But axe, once again, gets out of the ground early, gets on top of them, manages to stop them. And you look at wild caption here, it's again the same sort of type as the high marsh and the Latrobe coming through, that there are the erect plant types that don't have the vigorous growth to get out of the way. So just the conclusions, selecting your varieties for your paddocks. So going and actually sitting down with your farmers and going, well, taking records at harvest and going, yeah, there was ryegrass over here, because obviously, especially with the barley, you're going to be reaping your wheat, you're going to know where your high patches are, and yes, you're going to hope in a perfect world your pre-em chemicals are going to clear it up for you, and you've got your other strategies, but choosing those varieties for those certain paddocks can really affect your bottom line. So if you're getting a 1 or 2 tonne loss, that's that's probably a bit extreme, but there's some paddock, it mightn't be the whole paddock yield, but there's certainly areas where it is going to change your end profitability. Here too from now, hopefully the breeders can keep producing competitive varieties. So like I said, that the D-Bow Aurora is a big step for durum, because that's getting rid of one problem. They're getting closer to their screenings targets, and getting a competitive variety is a good thing for durum industry. I'll continue to keep doing research. I've got another 3 or 4 years on this barley project, so hopefully we might even be able to change the trial design a little bit and get a little bit more quality data, and be 100% sure on new varieties coming through, and as they come through, watch out to see how they perform. So as mentioned, this is good. This is good thing to incorporate. Your long-term weeds management, you've got all your things going in, you've got your chaff carts, you've got your rotation of chemicals. This is just another tool to add to that. So people are going out and buying chaff carts and then bringing all these things together, and it's like building a team. Every team member counts, and the more team members you got on your side, the better chance you have of stopping the problem and succeeding. So yeah, that's all for me.